A first grader stood in front of his class and he delivered a speech about what he wanted to be when he grew up. He said, "I'm going to be a lion tamer and have lots of fierce lions. I'll walk into the cage and they'll roar and they'll roar and and then all of a sudden it occurred to him what he was saying. And he stopped and he said, "But of course, I'll have my mama with me." Why would a first grader want his mama with him? Well, because being surrounded by lions is scary business, right? Tonight we turn our attention to Daniel chapter 6. Lions are dangerous animals. They are large and they are intimidating. This is really one of the famous Old Testament stories. This is the Old Testament lion story. It's the story of Daniel and the lions, and a favorite among Sunday school students. The children love it. It has everything. It has danger, adventure, suspense, and a great ending. It is one of the most beloved stories in the Bible. Why is this story important to us? That's really the question that we want to ask tonight. And that's the approach that we want to take in our Bible study. Why is this lesson important to us? Well, one of the first lessons, I think, as we read through, particularly those first chapters of Daniel, is the lesson that, well, nations rise and nations fall. We have seen that actually through Old Testament history as we have gone and we have watched the Israelites come into the promised land. Nation rose, this great nation of Israel, King David, King Solomon. But then the nation began to fall. It split in half of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom, there was hardly a godly king. Well, there wasn't really, was there? Not a godly king in the whole group. When it came to the southern kingdom, well, they were hard to come by, but there were a few there. The thing that we learned out of that, though, is that the northern kingdom, as they continued to drift away from the Lord, is that nations fall. And the northern kingdom of Israel fell into the hands of the Assyrians. And it wasn't long after that that the southern kingdom, Judah, fell into the hands of the Babylonians. Now, that really is what brings us to the book of Daniel. In Daniel chapter 1, we know that the Babylonians brought in some Jews and they immersed them into Babylonian culture. They changed their names, they changed their language, they changed everything about it, including their diet. Or at least they wanted to in chapter 1. But you have Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That group convinced a chief official to let them maintain their own diet. They were allowed to do that. So chapter 1 is under control of the Babylonians. We see that all the way through chapter 3, where Nebuchadnezzar is in charge, and we have the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in that fiery furnace. We can go all the way to chapter 4, but then from chapter 4 to chapter 5, there's a transition in leadership from Nebuchadnezzar to his son Belshazzar. By the end of Daniel chapter 5, though, nations rise, nations fall. Daniel chapter 5, verse 30 says, "That very night Belshazzar, the king of the Babylonians, was slain. And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. That's Daniel chapter 5, verses 30 and 31. So we've watched, from Judah, those taken away into captivity, and they're in Babylonia with King Nebuchadnezzar. Then we're seeing Darius of the Medes, the Medo-Persian Empire eventually will come out of all of that we will watch. But what we see is nations rise, nations fall. Then we come to chapter 6, this beloved story of Daniel and the lions. It's a favorite among children, but again, what is the lesson for us? Why is this an important story for us? So let's begin, and we're going to walk our way through the story, at least the majority of it. Going to kind of do like we did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and I'll tell you at a point where we'll stop, and I hope you'll understand why. Daniel chapter 6, verse 1. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. Darius, I have to give him some credit here, he's organizing his kingdom. And he has 120 satraps in place. At least that's what the New International Version calls them. The King James Version calls them princes. The New Living Translation, it translates Daniel chapter 6, verse 1 this way. Darius the Mede decided to divide the kingdom into 120 provinces, and he appointed a high officer to rule over each province. So we're seeing, however the translation puts it, what we're seeing is organization. I have 120 satraps, princes, high officials. They are reporting to three administrators. Some translations call them presidents or governors, and Daniel was one of the 3. Daniel proved himself to be more capable than the others. These exceptional qualities that he had. So King Darius, as I read this, it seems that he's got the 120, then he's got the administrators, the presidents or governors, but eventually they would report to Daniel, who would report to Darius. The New American Standard, by the way, important statement here, says that Daniel possessed an extraordinary spirit. Others will talk about it using the word attitude. But Daniel had some exceptional abilities about him. But this is politics. And we shouldn't be surprised that other leaders were jealous of Daniel, the 120 and the other administrators. They're jealous. They're jealous of Daniel and his success, so they put together this plot, this ploy to bring him down. We begin to uncover that in chapter 6, verse 4. At this, the administrators and the satraps, they tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, we will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. I think this is one of the greatest statements in the Bible. Daniel's enemies looked for skeletons in his closet, and they couldn't find any because there were none. They couldn't find anything. The New Living Translation puts it this way. They couldn't find anything to criticize or condemn. He was faithful, always responsible, and completely trustworthy. Faithful, always responsible, completely trustworthy. Unfortunately, there are not a lot of people, I don't think, that could pass that kind of a test of character. It may be a skeleton in our closet. Maybe something we did in the past. We're not proud of it, but it is part of our past. It's part of something that we did or who we were. Maybe a skeleton in the closet. Or it could be a chink in our armor, an area of vulnerability. And our enemies scope that out and they see that. And they plot to use that against us. But what we can tell, as I can tell you this, is that godly people, because we see this in Daniel, godly people can succeed in an ungodly world. However, when godly people succeed, expect others to be jealous. And don't expect them to take it just sitting down. They are going to look for something. They are going to try to find something. And it's really difficult for a Christian, really one that might have a past of who they were, but not who they are. And they're going to try to use that and bring it up, or they're going to try to find that area of vulnerability and use against us. I didn't say the road was easy, and that is going to be something we see throughout this chapter. It doesn't mean that the road is easy, but I do think it speaks of Daniel. I do think it speaks of his character. And then we also learn a lot about his enemies and their desire to exploit something about him. But it had to do, if they were going to find anything to use against him, it had to do, he was consistent here. It had to do with the law of his God. So here we go. Let's look at what plot they would put in place. So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king, and they said, "May King Darius live forever." Now, if you're going to try to get something from the king and try to get him on your side and to be part of this ploy, whether he knows it or not, how do you do that? Well, in their case, they inflated his ego. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so it cannot be altered, in accordance with the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree in writing. Boy, the plot has been put into place, has it not? They convinced him to put it into writing, and here's what it is. Over the next 30 days, they felt like they could take care of this in 30 days. That if anybody prayed to anyone, anything else other than you, King Darius. Again, it's that whole thing that we see somewhere. There were people in Old Testament times that they saw themselves as gods, little g. But that's what the other officials have put into place to have Darius. Well, look at him. And Darius is now saying, "Look at me." And so there's this decree that's put into place, and he signed it. What we're going to find out is that the Medo-Persians, that when they do that it can't be repealed. Okay, so everything's in place. They propose the plan. Only Darius is to be worshipped. So let's look and let's find out what happened. All right? Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Character has been defined. I like this definition, as who you are when no one is looking. Now, Daniel was not like the Pharisees that we read in the New Testament. Boy, they like to put on a show. They like to do things, in this case, whether it's to pray or something else. They like to do that to be seen by others. That's not who Daniel was. Nor do I get the sense that Daniel went into hiding. Daniel was a man of character, but he was also consistent. And as we look at that, we see that consistency. His enemies knew exactly where they could find him. They knew exactly when they could find him. And they did. They knew that he would pray. They knew they could count on Daniel to be a man of prayer. Again, wow, what a compliment. Can you imagine just being known so much as a man or woman of prayer? That if people, if they're thinking anything about you, now in this case they're trying to trap him, but be it thinking good or bad, but the first thing that somebody thinks when they think about you is your loyalty, your commitment to the Lord, your commitment to His Word, your commitment to faith, and your commitment to prayer. Wow. He continued to pray just as he had done before. So we turn to chapter 6, verse 11. Here we go. Then these men went as a group. They found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and they spoke to him about his royal decree. Did not you publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, Remember, your majesty, that according to the laws of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. This group could not wait to point the finger at Daniel. They went to the king. Boy, they knew this decree, didn't they? Because they kept bringing it up. They came to the king and said, Do you remember that decree you passed? Yes, he did. And so King Darius names it off. Well, Daniel, he's praying to his God. And it maybe at that point, it seems like maybe Darius realized at least some of what was going on. Because it says that he was doing his very best to try to resolve this issue. He was making every effort to save Daniel. So the officials have been to the king once. They come back again. Remember, well, there we go again. Remember this decree that you issued, this edict that you issued, it cannot be repealed. So not only have they got you to Daniel, but they got the king between a rock and a hard place, because he has to enforce the decree that he issued and that he signed. The king was left without any other option. He had to throw Daniel in the lion's den. So that's where we come to chapter 6, verse 16. So the king gave the order. They brought Daniel and they threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, May your God whom you serve continually rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the king of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. When we turn to the New Testament, the early church faced intense persecution. Acts chapter 8, verse 3 says that Saul set out to destroy the church. Acts chapter 9, verse 1 says that he was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. Now, Saul, the very one that was leading that persecution, became a Christian in Acts chapter 9. Then he became the target of that persecution. And we could go through and read in his letters, particularly in 2 Corinthians, where he goes through this long list of this intense persecution that he faced as a result of being a follower of Jesus Christ. I think about other New Testament writings. 1 Peter is a great example. It's 5 chapters long, and in every chapter, persecution is mentioned. Revelation chapter 2, be thou faithful unto death. It's because they were facing persecution. So what's the point, Johnny? Well, the point is that, and Jesus told us this, if you become a follower of Jesus Christ, the road's not going to be easy. Expect trouble. Expect persecution. Why is that? Because godly people can be successful in an ungodly world. However, ungodly people will be very jealous of godly people. Ungodly people will be very jealous of godly people. And that's what we see. We see that among New Testament Christians, but we also see that in the Old Testament in Daniel's story. There was jealousy. The plot was put in place. And at this point, the the satraps and the other administrators, boy, they think they have just got this thing knocked out. They think problem solved. The only thing that they did not take into account was God. If Daniel was consistent with the law of his God, what would God do? They didn't stop to consider that, did they? But that's going to be important for us to know. Now, if we turn to Hebrews 11, one more thought. When we turn to Hebrews 11, we find that Old Testament heroes like Daniel faced persecution. Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. Now, this was no threat. This is not a fictitious children's story. This was a real moment when Daniel's faith faced a tremendous test. Daniel's faith faced a tremendous test. And God delivered Daniel in an amazing way. We turn to the last section of verses that we're going to read tonight. Verse 19 through 23, and at first light of dawn, the king got up and he hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called out to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to rescue you from the lions? Daniel answered, may the king live forever. My God sent his angel and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed, gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. King Darius was unable to sleep that night. I think that may be the best thing that I see about Darius in the whole story. Apparently he had a conscience. It bothered him. He was very concerned about Daniel. He was unable to sleep. So at first light, he hurried to the lion's den and he called out. He said, Daniel, the servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to rescue you from the lions? I don't know. Did he expect Daniel to respond? Was this one where he's just trying to comfort himself? Was it a question of hope? Or was it one of regret? Was he sure that God would be able to deliver him or not? I don't know. I don't know. But when he called out, can you imagine the relief, the joy that he felt when Daniel responded? And how did Daniel respond? Giving the glory to God. He responded by giving the glory to God. Now in Daniel chapter 3, we talked a couple of weeks ago about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they were thrown into the fiery furnace. It says that when they were brought out of the fiery furnace that not a thread was scorched. There wasn't even the smell of smoke on their clothes. And when Daniel came out of that lion's den, he was completely unharmed. There was nothing about him that there was an issue. No wound was found on him. Daniel had trusted in the Lord. It's a story of, well, there's a adventure, there's danger, there's suspense, and then it has a great ending. I guess that's why children love it. I need us to understand this as adults, that every story of faith and courage does not have an ending like that. We see that in Scripture. In fact, I want to read to you from Hebrews chapter 11, verses 35 through 37. It says, there were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two, and they were killed by the sword. Johnny, why do you bring that up? Because this story has a great ending in Daniel chapter 6. It does. It has a fantastic ending. And every story of faith does not end on earth that way. It didn't then and it doesn't now. What we know is that there are countless numbers of Christians that lose their lives every year because of their faith in God. So we need to know that. And here's why I say that, because I like the way that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had put it in Daniel chapter 3. They said, we know that God has the power to save us, but even if He does not, we will not bow down and worship your image, King Nebuchadnezzar. And we need to hear that, because our assurance of faith, let me make this real clear. Whether our story here ends in whether it's a great ending like Daniel 6, or whether it's one like one of the ones I just read out of Hebrews chapter 11, understand this. Understand this. We're not defeated. Regardless of how that story ends on earth, we are not defeated. The victory has been won. The victory was won when Jesus Christ died on the cross, was buried in the tomb, and death could not hold Him back. Jesus had promised His disciples, He said, I am going to prepare a place for you, and if I go to prepare a place for you, I'll come back and take you to be with me so that you may be where I am. Jesus paid the price for our sin. And so the victory's won. We're not defeated, regardless of how that story turns out on earth. When we stand up and have courage and faith, and when we live by faith, regardless of how that story ends here on earth, if we're faithful to the Lord, the victory has been won. And we need to know that. The victory has been won.